There are moments that if you miss them, you will carry the what if for the rest of your days. For Margaret Hale, that moment came on a dust-heavy morning in Dry Creek when the rumble of wagon wheels carried her father to her door, not with kindness, but with a bargain. A bargain that would strip her of the last scraps of choice she had. Her father had called her too big to be loved, too old for any man to want. And when whispers of her pregnancy reached the town, his shame burned hotter than his love. So he did what no parent should. He traded her for a horse. The man waiting at the end of that trade was Caleb Whitlock, a giant cowboy with hands like iron and eyes like winter. The town feared him. Margaret feared him too, until he spoke. Not words of ownership, not demand, but something she hadn't heard in decades: choice. Still in a place where gossip moves faster than the wind, every kindness hides the risk of being taken away. And when storms both in the sky and in the heart begin to break over this unlikely pairing, Margaret will be forced to ask herself, is she stepping into another prison with prettier walls, or has she finally found a place where she is wanted not despite who she is, but because of it? What happened the night the fever came, and why did Caleb's next words change everything? The town of Dry Creek had a way of swallowing people whole. Dust blew through its single street carrying whispers faster than the wind could push them. And in those whispers, Margaret Hale had long been a favorite topic. At 50 years old, Margaret was no stranger to the cruelty of being watched, measured, and found wanting. She was heavy-set, broad-shouldered, soft in all the places the world told women they shouldn't be. The lines on her face were carved not by time alone, but by years of swallowing her words and holding her chin up when laughter followed her down the road. Her father had been the sharpest thorn in her life. Once he told her she was too big to be loved, as if affection were a dress she could never fit into. When Margaret had been younger, he'd tried to marry her off to a widower who wanted a cook, not a wife. She refused. That act of defiance sealed her fate in his eyes, ungrateful, unworthy. In the small hours of the morning, she would sit by her cabin window mending clothes by lamplight. Her hands were rough from years of work, washing for other families, tending gardens, not her own, yet she stitched with the care of someone who knew how much a good seam could hold together. She carried her dignity quietly like a candle cupped in her palms, shielding it from the harsh winds of other people's opinions. But even the strongest flame can sputter in a storm, and a storm was coming for Margaret. One that would begin with the sound of wagon wheels, and her father's voice calling her name. She didn't yet know it, but the choice he would give her that day would change the rest of her life. The wagon rattled to a stop in front of Margaret's cabin. She stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron, her pulse quickening at the sight of her father climbing down. His face was set in that same tight-lipped disapproval she'd known since childhood. "Get your things," he said without greeting. "You're coming with me." Margaret hesitated. "Why?" He didn't answer, just jerked his head toward the wagon bed. There under a patched tarp, the shape of a saddle and bridle peeked out, and beside them, a tall, raw-boned horse, the color of desert sand, tied to the rail. It took her a moment to understand. When she did, her breath caught. "You traded me," she said quietly, each word tasting like dust. Her father's jaw clenched. "That horse'll work harder than you ever did. But the man who owns it, he says he's willing to take you off my hands. Big fella, needs a wife." Her stomach twisted. She thought of the stories she'd heard about the man in question, a giant cowboy named Caleb Whitlock. Folks said he could snap a fence post in half with his bare hands. Others claimed he hadn't smiled in years. Margaret stood there, the wind catching the edges of her apron. She could walk away, back into the cabin, back into the life she knew. But that life was nothing more than slow suffocation. When Caleb appeared from around the corner of the livery stable, his frame filling the sunlight, she expected menace. Instead, his eyes, shadowed beneath his hat, held something she hadn't seen in a long time. Recognition. It was as if he knew her, though they'd never met. What he said next was not part of the trade, and it was the first crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. Caleb's voice was deep, deliberate, like he measured each word before letting it out. "I don't care what they said to bring you here," he told Margaret. "You're not something to be traded. If you stay with me, it's by your choice." The words should have been a comfort, but they only stirred up more turmoil inside her. Choice. That was a thing she'd been denied so many times, it felt almost foreign. Margaret glanced toward her father, expecting him to object. He didn't. His attention was on the horse already judging the worth of his bargain. That indifference cut deeper than any insult. Caleb waited silent, his broad frame casting a shadow over her. His size should have frightened her, but instead it made her feel oddly shielded, and that frightened her even more. She thought of every door that had been slammed in her face every time a man's eyes had darted away at the sight of her size, her age. She remembered the proposals withdrawn when her dowry wasn't enough, or the quiet cruelty of being told she was too much in every way that mattered. Was this different, or was she just another transaction, one man's burden and another man's gamble? Her heart whispered, "Don't trust it." Her bones whispered, "You're tired of being alone." When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. "I'll stay, but not because you own me." Caleb's mouth quirked into the smallest, almost imperceptible smile. "Good. Then we'll start as equals." And for the first time in years, she felt the faintest shift, like the ground beneath her might finally hold. The wagon ride to Caleb's ranch was quiet, save for the creak of wheels and the occasional snort from the horse. Margaret sat beside him, clutching the worn shawl around her shoulders, the fabric smelling faintly of smoke from her father's hearth. Every mile they traveled felt like a mile further from the life she had known, and further into the unknown. When they reached the ranch, the sun was settling low, spilling gold across the weathered boards of the house. It wasn't grand, but it was sturdy straight lines, strong beams, and a porch that looked like it had been mended more than once. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and bread. A fire crackled in the hearth, and a large, gentle-eyed dog lifted its head from the rug to watch her enter. "This'll be your room," Caleb said, opening a door to a small space with a narrow bed, a chest at the foot, and a single window looking out toward the cottonwoods. "It's not much." Margaret ran her fingers along the quilt's stitching. The fabric was faded, but every patch told a story, scraps from shirts, dresses, maybe curtains. Someone had cared enough to make it last. "You can unpack when you're ready," Caleb added. No rush. She wanted to believe him, but part of her braced for the moment when kindness would turn to condition. She had seen it too many times before, soft words hiding hard truths. That night she lay awake listening to the wind moving through the cottonwoods. It didn't feel like her home. Not yet. But it didn't feel like her prison either. And that, she thought, might be enough for now. Morning light crept across the quilt before Margaret stirred. She rose early, not from obligation, but habit. Years of waking before sunrise to tend to chores had etched it into her bones. She found the kitchen cool and silent, the fire reduced to embers. She lit it again, not knowing if she was overstepping. Measured flour, drew water from the pump. By the time Caleb came in from the barn, the smell of biscuits and coffee filled the air. He paused in the doorway, a shadow stretching long across the floor. "You didn't have to." Margaret didn't look up from the dough. "I know." The girls, Caleb's nieces, she soon learned, tumbled in from the porch, all loose braids and bare feet. They stopped short, eyes wide. "You cook?" the older one asked. Margaret smiled softly. "I do a bit." They ate together, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret heard the kind of laughter that didn't feel forced. But even as warmth began to seep into her bones, she felt the weight of the town's eyes. At the mercantile whispers followed her, "Too old. Bought for convenience. Won't last." She told herself she didn't care. But some nights when the wind pressed hard against the windows, she wondered if she was only a passing figure in their lives, a temporary fix for loneliness. Yet each morning she rose before the sun. Because even if it wasn't yet her place, the smell of fresh bread and the sound of giggling girls made it feel a little more hers. It was the kind of storm that made the prairie feel endless. Sky split open with lightning wind, lashing the windows like it meant to take the house with it. Caleb had just come in from tying down the barn doors when he found Margaret kneeling beside the bed upstairs. One of the girls, Emma, lay pale and sweating, her breath shallow. The fever had come on sudden fast as a rattler strike. "I'll fetch Doc Merritt," Caleb said, but Margaret shook her head. "Not in this weather. You'd never make it back." She stayed there through the nightcloth in hand, whispering songs so soft they nearly blended with the storm outside. Caleb sat in the doorway, helpless in the way only men feel when strength is useless. Around dawn, Emma's fever broke. The little girl's head lolled against Margaret's chest, her breath even and slow again. Margaret closed her eyes, and for a moment she let herself feel it, the quiet, dangerous swell of belonging. Downstairs, Caleb poured coffee with unsteady hands. When she joined him, her hair loose from its pins and her face drawn with exhaustion, he didn't thank her. He simply said, "I don't know what we do without you." Margaret met his gaze and realized the truth. He wasn't speaking about the fever anymore. Outside, the storm had passed, but inside, something had shifted forever. The days after the storm felt lighter, as if the wind had blown away more than just dust. Caleb lingered longer at the breakfast table. The girls laughed louder in the yard, and Margaret, she allowed herself to hope. But in a small town, whispers have a way of finding their way to your door. One afternoon, as she walked back from the mercantile, Mrs. Porter called out, "Careful, Margaret. Folks are saying you're looking to trap that man." Margaret didn't answer. She'd lived long enough to know the weight of cruel words, but this time they didn't sink as deep. Still, she wondered, had she overstayed her welcome? That evening, as the sun turned the prairie gold, Caleb found her sitting on the porch steps, mending one of Emma's dresses. "You're thinking of leaving," he said quietly. She looked down at her hands. "If it would spare you trouble, Margaret," he interrupted, stepping closer. "I don't care what they say. My girls need you. I need you." Her breath caught. "I can't promise riches," he continued, "but I can promise you'll never be unwanted here." Margaret felt the years of loneliness pull at her, the echoes of every door that had shut in her face, and then she saw the girls watching from the window, hope shining in their eyes. She smiled soft, certain. "Then I'll stay." It wasn't a rescue, it was a choice, and for the first time in decades, it was hers to make. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with fireworks or the gallop of horses. Sometimes it comes quietly, like the first warm light after a long winter, until you realize it's been there holding you all along. For Margaret Hale, the girl once traded for a horse love was not a rescue but a choice. She stayed not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had finally found a home where her presence was wanted, her laughter cherished, her silence respected. And for Caleb Whitlock, the man feared by the town, love was not a surrender, but a recognition of a soul as weathered and strong as his own. In the end, it wasn't the gossip, the past, or the shame that defined them. It was the small things: fresh bread in the morning, a child's head resting in the crook of her arm, a man fixing a loose hinge without being asked. Little acts of care that, woven together, made something strong enough to last a lifetime. We all have storms, we all have whispers. But sometimes, if we're willing to step forward, we can find the place where we are seen, not despite who we are, but because of it. If this story touched your heart, I'd love for you to subscribe to None, Wild West Saga, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and leave a comment below. Do you want to hear what happened next for Margaret and Caleb? Or would you like more stories of late blooming love and quiet redemption?